Should the federal government have the power to prohibit states from legalizing sports gambling? That's our question for today. And we're joined by Jonathan Wood, attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And so, of course, 5 years ago, New Jersey Republican Governor Chris Christie made an attempt to legalize sports wagering in the state of New Jersey. At the time, and even now, Christie argues that this would raise millions in tax dollars for the state. And Jonathan, the professional sports leagues and the Department of Justice challenged Christie's law on this. And why is that?
So they claim that it violates a federal statute, the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. That statute makes it illegal for states to, quote, authorize sports betting by law, which the courts have interpreted to mean that states are essentially forbidden from reforming their own sports gambling laws. This really is a one-of-a-kind statute in our nation's history.
Of course, so PASPA, passed in 1992, prohibits states from licensing, sponsoring, or authorizing sports betting, right? Mm-hmm. But it only applies to 46 states because Nevada, of course, Nevada with Las Vegas, Delaware, Oregon, and Montana have exemptions because they had legalized sports betting before 1992, and this federal action was taken.
That's right. There is no federal ban on sports betting.
Okay.
There's only this provision that makes it illegal for states
Okay.
to reform their own laws. So all of the states that had some form of sports betting before the statute was enacted in 1992 continue to have it, and none of the other states have the same rights as their neighbors to do so as well. Mm-hmm. And so Christie and New Jersey voters were fed up with this situation. They actually passed a referendum by a whopping 2-to-1 margin calling for the state to reform its sports gambling laws and finally legalize sports gambling. The reason is simple. It's not working. Illegal black market sports betting is a $100 billion a year business.
$100 billion.
That's right. Everyone violates the statute. Former President Obama went on national TV on the Today Show or the Tonight Show with Stephen Colbert, and actually bragged after the Super Bowl that he placed illegal bets on the Super Bowl. The host pointed it out, and he said, "Oh, I'll just pardon myself."
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is no one takes these prohibitions seriously, and so states are stuck with this law that they can't realistically enforce, but they also can't change.
So, why have these sports leagues, why have they been so opposed to legalized gambling? And why are they so opposed in this case of allowing states to determine on their own, and the populations within these states determine whether or not they want to move forward with the legalization of sports gambling?
Well, one of the ironies is that even though many of the leagues are challenging what New Jersey is trying to do, they're publicly saying that they think PASPA has failed and needs to be changed, that the reality is sports betting is happening, it's the reason why they're getting viewers, and it needs to be legalized. But they still insist that states shouldn't be able to reform their own laws.
So this is a states' rights issue in a way. It may be a constitutional issue, of
absolutely.
course.
It's a constitutional issue about whether the federal government gets to dictate to the states and basically treat them as puppets. If Congress wants to forbid sports betting, it can. It has the constitutional power. But it can't simply point to states and say, okay, you have to do it for us. And that's what PASPA does.
And Jonathan, you're a constitutional attorney. And so why is this important for our viewers and those that may not be the biggest sports fans out there?
So this matters regardless of your feelings on sports betting because it applies across the board. The PASPA, if it's constitutional, means that Congress can forbid states from reforming any number of laws. So whatever policy area you care about, you probably want states to be able to have the power to experiment and find new ways to solve the problem. Well, this would allow Congress to stop that in its tracks. A good comparison is marijuana policy. A few years ago, all the states forbade it. Congress, if PASPA was constitutional, could have stopped all of the recent federalism revolution we've seen by simply saying states can't repeal their marijuana laws. Okay.
And so New Jersey is arguing that this law, or this 1992 federal law, violates what's known as the anti-commandeering doctrine. Can you kind of explain that? That's the 10th Amendment. That falls under the 10th Amendment. Can you kind of go through that real quick?
Sure, that's right. So the 10th Amendment basically sets out the nature of our constitutional government. There's a federal government and state governments, and they're separate. The state has separate powers and is immune from federal control. And relying upon that, the Supreme Court has repeatedly said that Congress exceeds its constitutional authority when it tries to control the states, when it says you must either adopt this policy or implement this policy. So, for instance, it struck down a federal requirement that state law enforcement officers do background checks to enforce federal gun laws, saying that that was simply just trying to control what the states do with their own officials. And we think that's exactly what's going on here. Pacific Legal Foundation filed an amicus brief on behalf of itself, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Cato Institute, and Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, basically saying that here Congress is trying to avoid taking responsibility for banning sports gambling and instead forcing that on the states by saying that you have to enforce your bans forever. You no longer have the authority to change.
And so now the pro-leagues and the Department of Justice are responding with the argument that no, PASPA does not violate this anti-commandeering doctrine because this 1992 Act does not obligate the state to adopt any scheme, right? It's simply saying you can't change what you've already done. And so they're making this kind of what seems, I'm not an attorney, but they're kind of making this argument that somehow this isn't commandeering the state, and this isn't like compelling them to move a certain way.
That's right, and that's the issue that the Supreme Court agreed to decide when it decided to take up the case earlier this year. I think the argument by the leagues and by the state or by the federal government is clever, but I don't think it will carry the day, because the distinction between the federal government saying to states you have to adopt this new policy or you have to enforce this old policy forever is facile. That could apply to absolutely anything, and it would ultimately undermine federalism.
Okay. And so specific to this, right, sports gambling, leagues have historically been opposed to this, and this goes back almost 100 years. The Black Sox scandal, look into that, and you have up to, Pete Rose betting on baseball, right, in all these cases. And now Las Vegas. So let's talk about Las Vegas. Of course, they now have the Oakland Raiders. They'll be moving there in a few years, and they have an NHL team coming in. Do you think part of this, and I don't know if this is something that's part of your legal argument here, but these leagues, they've been maybe a little bit averse to the idea of having even teams in a place like Las Vegas, right? Because of the chance that it may compromise the integrity of their leagues.
You're right. That is certainly part of the motivation for the leagues. But think about it like this: do you think the sports leagues games are going to be more likely to be affected by a $100 billion illegal gambling market or a legal and heavily regulated market? I think the sports leagues essentially haven't learned the lessons of Prohibition, where we found out that if you try to legalize something people want and you have a huge black market, you're asking for all sorts of criminal elements to be involved. And so if we just legalize sports gambling and regulate it effectively, I think you would eliminate that concern. But having a huge, lucrative, illegal market is just asking for those sorts of problems. Okay.
And so moving forward here, can you kind of set the scene here? What's coming up here in the next few weeks and months with this case? What can we expect? And what does this mean? What does the result mean? If it goes in favor of the governor up there in New Jersey.
So the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case this summer, and they're briefing the issue right now. I expect oral argument will be held either in December or January. And I think New Jersey has a lot of reason for hope. It takes 4 justices to vote to approve a case, and it takes 4 justices to call for the United States to weigh in, which happened earlier last year. At the time that those 4 justices voted to do that, Gorsuch wasn't yet on the court. So since then, you've added a 5th conservative justice who cares about federalism and separation between the federal government and the states. So I think it's pretty easy to count to 5 there. You've got pretty good odds, pardon the sports betting pun, that ultimately the justices are going to be very receptive to an argument that really will fundamentally reshape our constitutional order. PASPA is honestly one of a kind. Generally, when the federal government wants to regulate or prohibit something, it does so directly. So the federal government prohibits the sale of drugs and regulates everything, essentially. Here, they didn't do that. There is no federal prohibition. They instead try to use the states as puppets, and that, I think, is going to concern the court.
All right, and then 2 more quick questions, Jonathan. First off, is there a legislative fix, right? This beyond this case and that. Is there a push for a legislative remedy? What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. There has been a push for the federal government to repeal PASPA or reform it for years. Everyone recognizes that it has failed. You can't have this large illegal sports gambling market with this statute. So as I said, even the sports leagues recognize something has to change. So whether that happens because the Supreme Court strikes down the law or not, ultimately I think you're going to see some sort of political change.
And my final question, you're a sports guy? You're an NFL guy? You got a team?
I do. A Dallas Cowboys fan. I grew
Dallas
up
Cowboys?
in Texas
Okay.
in the 80s and 90s, so I sort of saw them at their peak and then at their worst.
Okay, and so, legalizing sports gambling and that, with a team like the Cowboys in recent decades, that might hurt your pocketbook.
It might. I should stay away no matter what happens, but...
But you're happy with another core issue, not just to close things out, with Zeke Elliott, right? This is another issue that if you're an NFL fan following the Cowboys, I feel like as an NFL fan these days, I'm getting just as much of a law school education as I am in the classroom, right? I mean, I'm reading about all these arbitration cases and that.
Well, the Cowboys have always been a good source for learning criminal law and lots of other laws, so that continues to this day.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us today, Jonathan. Really appreciate you coming in. Keep us in the loop on this, and maybe we can talk again as this moves through the Supreme Court.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.